So there once was a hero, and he was so awesome that he became a legend. And his name was Zelda. Now you may never have been to Hyrule, and you may not know who the Kokoris are, and you may never have endured the horrors of the Water Temple. You may never have even played a video game before, but odds are if you exist in this modern age, you have heard the phrase Legend of Zelda. And if you have played video games and you've never played Legend of Zelda, you're doing it wrong, okay? You're doing it wrong. And before I delve deeper, I need to say this. The Legend of Zelda is not the greatest puzzle game of all time. It's not even the greatest adventure game of all time. It's not even the greatest Nintendo game of all time. The Legend of Zelda is the greatest game of all time, period. Which Zelda game, do you ask? All of them are the greatest. That is where I stand, and if you don't like that, go away. Just leave. Go. Shoo. Goodbye. Do you even remember when the first Zelda game came out? I mean, I don't, because I didn't even know what video games were at the time, so I probably couldn't even pronounce Zelda, but I've heard stories. The Legend of Zelda released for the Nintendo Entertainment System was so amazing, so epic, so legendary, that it was the first game to come with a save function. Yeah, that's right. The developers knew that this game was going to be so awesome and so challenging that you would probably not beat it in one setting, so you'd need to be able to save your progress throughout the game. The Legend of Zelda was sort of counterculture to Super Mario, whereas in Mario you were playing a very straightforward, very linear, very simple game. The Legend of Zelda was the complete opposite. It was not straightforward, it was complex, and it definitely wasn't linear. I mean, when you start up Zelda, you're just dropped into a world and you don't even know what you're supposed to be doing. You don't even have a weapon, you're just getting owned. And then you realize that there's a cave that you can go into and there's some old guy that's like, "It's dangerous to go out there alone, take this." And you're like, "Thanks, dude," and you get a sword. And then you're off on your adventure, wandering around trying to figure out what you're supposed to do, and you come across a temple. And in this temple, you go through and you find a map, and you find a compass, and you find some cool items that you can use that do cool things, like the boomerang and the bombs, and it makes things a little bit easier. And then you get to the end, and there's some wicked crazy boss that you have to kill, and you're like, "Oh my god!" And you kill him. And then you get a heart container, which makes you have more health. And then you go and you get a Triforce piece. You're like, "Oh, that's my objective. I've got to find the Triforce pieces. Cool." So you go on from temple to temple collecting Triforce pieces and you're on your way. And did I mention how insanely difficult this game is? Holy crap! This game was hard. I mean, jeez. I know there are going to be some elitists out there like, "Yeah, this game was cake. I mean, shut up, okay? This game was hard for me. Deal with it." But the game got a lot easier when you discovered that there were heart containers located in the overworld. And now you have a side mission where not only are you going around collecting the Triforce pieces, but you now have an option where you can go collect heart containers, which give you more health, which made things a lot easier on yourself. And you were doing all of that to this catchy tune. The original Legend of Zelda may not seem like much nowadays, but for its time, it was a genuine trendsetter. And then Nintendo released its sequel, The Adventures of Link. Wait a minute. I thought his name was Zelda. What can I say? Some people loved it and some people hated it, but The Adventures of Link wasn't really that bad. In fact, it was a pretty decent game. It just didn't follow that Legend of Zelda formula that we've come to know and love. But let's be fair to Nintendo, that formula didn't even exist back then. I mean, this was the second game in the series. I think what threw so many people off was just how much the sequel deviated from the original game. I mean, classic Zelda was all about the isometric view and progressing your character through collecting items and heart containers, whereas the sequel was a side-scroller, and you progressed your character by leveling up. Even the iconic hearts that represented your health were replaced with a life bar. In fact, I'd say that The Adventures of Link was a very stereotypical RPG for the console. It had the overworld with the random encounters and the towns full of useless people and grinding, lots of grinding. Then again, as stereotypical RPGs go, you could argue that The Adventures of Link was the best one out there. I mean, it did come with all the iconic themes from Legend of Zelda, like the characters and the music. And since the game was a side-scroller, it allowed the developers to focus more on character detail for Link and the monsters. And the game focused a lot more on story as well, which a lot of people liked. Also, this game was insanely hard. Holy crap. Remember how I said the original was hard? The sequel was 10 times harder. This game was like a masochist. This was like Satan level hard. I don't even know if that makes sense, but I don't even think Battletoads could hold a candle to how hard this game was. I want to retract that statement. But in the end, the Adventures of Link just seemed to deviate way too much from the original game. Classic Zelda had established so much that players just didn't get what they were expecting. I think it says a lot about a game when its sequel, being the best-selling action RPG on the console, just doesn't measure up to par. But again, The Legend of Zelda is in a league of its own. A few years went by, and then the legend became legendary when Nintendo released A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. In A Link to the Past, we were returned to the isometric view, character progression through finding items, and yes, we even had our hearts back. But this game was so much more. Everything was improved. The game looked better, the controls were better, the swordplay was better, Hyrule was a fully fleshed out world, and we actually had a useful world map. And there were towns with people that were actually helpful this time. And even though the game was a lot easier to play, it was more challenging than ever. And there was so much more to do this time around. Besides the main mission, you had so many hidden areas to uncover. There were mini games to play. You had to collect heart pieces instead of heart containers, where 4 heart pieces gave you a heart this time. So there were so many more to find. And you were given so many items to mess with this time around. Some of the more iconic ones being the hook shot in the bottle. You also found the power gloves, which allowed Link to lift heavier objects, and the Pegasus boots, which made Link run faster. But the most iconic item upgrade in the game had to be the Master Sword. Early on, you realize that your mission is to find the Master Sword, but in order to do this, you must go to 3 different dungeons and find the pendants. And then you get the Master Sword and you think that you're near the end of the game. But you're not. You're just getting started, and now you have to go to 7 more dungeons before you're at the end. And not only that, you've unlocked this whole new world called the Dark World. And now you must travel between the Light World and the Dark World and collect more items that get even stronger and go through dungeons and get the stuff there before you can go to the end and beat the final boss. A Link to the Past reinvigorated this series, and some will say that it's the greatest Zelda game of all time. I will say it's a game that still holds up to this day. You could argue that everything I've said up to this point is meaningless, because when The Legend of Zelda went 3D, it ascended to heights that none of us could have imagined. Ocarina of Time is still regarded as the greatest game of all time by so many, and still holds true to this day. Back in those days, there were 2 types of fanboys in my school: the Final Fantasy VII fanboys and the Ocarina of Time fanboys. Guess which one I was? Now, in terms of progression, Ocarina of Time really wasn't all that different from A Link to the Past. You were a little boy who had to go around to different dungeons to collect 3 different pendants, or stones in this case, to unlock the Master Sword, and then you go on to 5 more dungeons to get the things to go kill the final boss, and you pick up a bunch of equipment along the way. See? Same formula. But now you're doing it in 3D, and even though the game may not look like much these days, at the time it was amazing. And the world seems so massive, we'd never seen anything like it. Nintendo managed to stay true to the Zelda formula, but the 3D world opened so many new opportunities. Like, you now have this Z targeting system where you could lock on to your enemies and take them down. And you could also go in the first person view mode and aim your weapons more carefully. The land of Hyrule had become larger than ever, which meant that there was so much more to experience. The game now had a day and night cycle, and even though Hyrule may have seemed safe during the day, it was scary and dangerous at night. Now that there were so many more places to explore, there was so much more to do. The heart pieces made a return to the game, but they were more challenging to find than ever. The same could be said for the new Golden Skull tools which you could find, and finding them came with great reward. The transition to 3D also made the dungeons and puzzles so much more challenging. I'm looking at you, Water Temple. There were also other optional things that you could do, like help the Happy Mask guy sell all of his masks, and get the big Goron sword. But the real focus of the game was around what happened when you found the Master Sword. When Link pulls the Master Sword out of the pedestal in the Temple of Time, you move forward 7 years into the future, and now Link is no longer a child, he's an adult. and the world had changed so much. For example, the once thriving market of Hyrule was now overtaken by the undead, and as adult Link you could go around and see how much everything had changed. But the real cool thing was that there were now two incarnations of Link, Child Link and Adult Link, and you could switch back and forth between the two time periods. And there were only certain things you could experience as Adult Link, and there were things you would have to go back as Child Link to experience. At the time, the game seemed near flawless. In fact, there was really only one problem that people seemed to have with it. Soon after, Nintendo released a sequel to Ocarina of Time, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Now this game followed the story of Child Link. Now Majora's Mask was pretty much the same as Ocarina of Time, but it had some gameplay mechanics that made it very different. See, Link was now in the land of Termina, which was under threat by the evil Mask Majora, who had cursed the moon and turned it into a giant meteor that was hurling towards the earth that would destroy the world in 3 days. Yeah. So your objective was to stop Majora, but you only had 3 days to do it. However, using the power of the Ocarina of Time, you could send yourself back to the dawn of the first day, but doing so would wipe everything that you had done, except that you were able to keep all the items that you find. The game was actually pretty short because there were only 4 dungeons. Upon completing each dungeon, you were given a mask, and after collecting all 4, you had the means to beat Majora. But like pretty much every other Zelda game, there was a lot of optional content, and Majora's Mask was all about the optional content. You see, the Mask of Majora belonged to the Happy Mask guy that you met in Ocarina of Time. He teaches you a song called the Song of Healing, which allows you to capture the spirits of fallen heroes in masks. Upon equipping these masks, Link would take on a new form. These forms included a Dooku Scrub, a Goron, and a Zora. Each came with their own powers. Now you would obtain these masks as you would progress through the game because you would need them to complete the game. But there were a boatload of other masks that you could find. Now these masks may not change you into something like the other masks, but they did come with their own perks. Most notably was the bunny hood, which made Link run faster. And while you're collecting all the masks, you could also once again collect the heart pieces, and now there were more heart pieces than ever. But the really cool thing was how you found all of these things, because you were in a 3-day cycle and there were only certain things that would happen at certain times in the 3-day cycle. It was kind of like that movie Groundhog Day, where you wake up and you start all over again. So you had to be somewhere at a certain time to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish. The other notable thing about the game was just how dark the story was. They did not shy away from the fact that if you don't do something, these people are going to die. And you would deal with each person and their experiences individually, and you would get to know these characters and the hardships they're going through. And you would help them, and then you'd go back in time and everything you did was undone. It was almost heartbreaking to deal with. Majora's Mask proved that Nintendo could stay true to the Zelda formula but change just enough so that it felt unique and refreshing, and they would prove that even more with their next title. The Wind Waker may go down as the most timeless Zelda game in history, and this is my favorite Zelda game out of the bunch. Now, a lot of people who feel like games have to look realistic and there needs to be blood and guts and all that crap criticized the game because it looked really cartoony and Link was a kid and they felt like it was childish. However, from an artistic standpoint, you could not deny how polished the game was. The environments were breathtaking, the effects were stunning, and the facial expressions were entertaining. This was a very charming Hyrule. It was also a very wet Hyrule because it was almost completely an ocean. This time you found yourself sailing across the seas, controlling the wind, going from island to island, hunting treasure and exploring temples, all to get strong enough to take down Ganon to save the princess once again. Everything just seemed so polished this time. Combat felt smoother than ever, the music was inspiring, and the world just seemed so lively. Link was given a whole new arsenal which combined a lot of the old classics with some new favorites. I especially enjoyed picking up weapons that enemies dropped and using them in combat. Now the game did have a few setbacks. For example, it was really easy. The whole experience was not all that challenging. And as much fun as we had sailing across the seas at first, it became very tedious after a while and it would take you forever to get anywhere. However, in spite of these flaws, the game won over millions of fans, including myself, with its irresistible charm and light-hearted entertainment. And then Nintendo listened to all the criticism from their fans about how Wind Waker was lighthearted and too cartoony, and they released Twilight Princess, which looked much more realistic and was incredibly dark. It was incredibly dark. Hooray! Twilight Princess was almost in direct contrast to Wind Waker. The game looked a lot more realistic, and it was beautiful. And the game was a lot more story-driven and cinematic, and the story took a much darker turn than previous Zelda games. It was clear that Nintendo wanted us to relive the experience we had in Ocarina of Time, and being back in old Hyrule was very refreshing. The game followed the usual Zelda formula. You went into dungeons, collected items, became more powerful, combat was as good as it's ever been. In fact, it was improved on because now you could swing your sword while running, and Link can now fight while on an opponent's back. This was also Link's first steps into motion control when the game was ported over to the Wii, where you could now swing your sword by flicking your Wii remote, and you could aim your bow by aiming your Wii remote towards the screen, which was a very nice touch. This provided a whole new experience for this series, and it worked really well if you liked motion control. One of the key points of the game is that you could go in and out of the Twilight Realm, where Link would turn into a wolf. Now, Wolf Link was pretty cool. He was like what would happen when you put on the mask of Majora's Mask. He would change forms, and this form would have its own set of abilities. However, a lot of these abilities seemed to only be useful to progress a certain point in the game. Beyond that, he was just more like a watered-down version of Link. You could attack with him, and he had his one special attack where he could kill everything at once, but that was about it. For me, a lot of the wolf segments just seemed unnecessary, like killing the bugs. I didn't understand what I was doing. It just felt like it was there for the story. And because the game was so story-focused, it was also extremely linear, and you felt like you were on rails. And yeah, the game looked a lot more realistic, and there was a lot more story to sink your teeth into, but overall, the game just felt incredibly dull and uninspired. And yeah, there were plenty of side missions to do, but the world still felt incredibly empty and unalive. I mean, say all you want about Wind Waker's graphics, but at least the world was vibrant and lively. And I could say the same thing about Majora's Mask. It was incredibly dark, but at least the world was vibrant and there was so much going on in it. What I really liked about the game were the dungeons. They were probably some of the best dungeons of the entire series, and they provided a few really good and memorable boss encounters. I especially enjoyed the innovative way Nintendo took some of the old classic inventory items and used them in new ways. But the game quickly became really easy, and that's not to say that it wasn't fun, it just wasn't very challenging. There were times when I would finish boss encounters only to realize that I was still at full health. I didn't take any damage. What's up with that? So I'm not going to sit here and say the game was bad. I did have fun, but there was a lot of things I didn't like. Basically, the overall linear progression of the game and general sense of uninspired dullness that was the world that I was in just seemed to take away too much from what I enjoy about Zelda. And so after doing this whole pendulum thing between Wind Waker's cartoonish approach and Twilight Princess's bleak vibe, Nintendo answered with Skyward Sword. Yes, this game was a perfect marriage between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, where it had the mature-looking characters in Twilight Princess but captured the liveliness and expressiveness of the characters in Wind Waker. I mean, Zelda actually had a personality this time, unlike she did in Twilight Princess, which was nice. And this time the Legend of Zelda went full motion control when you could actually control the very direction that Link would swing his sword, and this was a key component to the combat system in the game, where in order to get past an enemy's guard, you would have to swing your sword just right to win. Motion control also allowed Nintendo to be a lot more creative with the puzzle-solving mechanics in the game, and it made dungeons that much more interesting. Skyward Sword was by far the best motion control game on the market, and it completely realized the fullness of the Nintendo Wii's potential. Now, whether or not this is a good thing depends on whether or not you like motion control. I personally found the whole experience refreshing, however, I had to be in the mood for it, and most of the time, I wasn't. The motion control mechanics were definitely the main focus of the game, but Skyward Sword did have other things to offer, like a compelling story. You were now a character that lived up on an island floating in the sky, and you could fly around on your bird and go from different islands and get treasures and find cool things to help you on your adventures. But most of the action would happen on the surface, and you would go to different drop points in the sky to different areas on the surface where you would enter dungeons and other areas to progress the story. Flying in the sky felt like sailing in Wind Waker, only it was a lot faster. It was pretty cool, but with it being all motion control-y, it was a little clunky and not as smooth as I would have liked. And getting equipment was a lot more fun this time around, because not only were you finding things down on the surface, but you could also buy and upgrade items in the shop found in Skyloft, which was the main city hub. And item selection was better than ever because you no longer had to pause the games to go into the menu, it was all real time. And with the motion control, it allowed for a lot of new creative uses with the items. I especially liked bowling the bombs around. And like all Zelda games, there was plenty of side missions to experience, but the game was incredibly linear. Perhaps even more so than Twilight Princess. I mean, there really was no vast open world to explore. It actually felt more like you were running through a bunch of hallways. This also led to a lot more backtracking, and when you would find new items, you would find yourself going back to old places to unlock areas that you couldn't reach before. And while the game was an enjoyable experience, it really didn't provide anything new to the series other than the motion control thing. It was clear that Miyamoto had bought into this motion control idea and believed that it was the way of the future, and a lot of reviewers hyped that up to the 10th degree. But I don't necessarily go along with it. Motion control was fun at times, but it was also a deterrent. Sometimes I found myself not wanting to play just because I didn't want to fling my wrist around all night. Skyward Sword was a good game, but it focused too little on what we were doing and too much on how we were doing it, and I think that hindered the experience. And so, for over 2 decades, The Legend of Zelda has captured the hearts of millions and given us some of the most wonderful gaming experiences of all times. And please forgive me for not mentioning the handheld titles from the Legend of Zelda series. I hear they're great, but because of my visual impairment and the screen size is so small, to my detriment, I have not been able to experience them. But what I will say about the major titles is that they've all been outstanding. However, I believe that the last 2 are a little bit less than legendary. You see, The Legend of Zelda is not about a story, it's about an adventure. The Land of Hyrule is not meant to be a linear experience, it's meant to be a vast, open world that you can explore. And it doesn't matter if Link is cel-shaded or realistic. It's about him exploring epic dungeons and acquiring new weapons and finding creative ways to use those weapons and having legendary boss battles. And those are the things that make The Legend of Zelda great. They always have and they always will. Because a lot of games have great graphics and a lot of games have a great story. But the experience that you have in The Legend of Zelda is an experience that you'll never have in any other game. And that's why it's legendary.